Oh, let's stop horsing around, shall we, and paint some Rohan horses. In this video today, I'm going to show you 3 awesome ways to paint some horses. Let's go. For our miniatures today, we will be using different techniques and focusing on creating a variety of brown horses. 2 of these were sprayed with matte black and the other with leather brown. To start off, we will use a large makeup brush and paint our 2 black horses with mocha skin. This is to get an all-over coverage for our brown base coat. And for you Citadel users out there, you can skip the first 2 steps and just spray Rhinox hide straight onto the horses as soon as you've assembled your miniatures. Now we will put one away and just focus on the other for the first horse of the video. Here is an early Chris tip for you. You don't always need to use the traditional colour range of paints. For example, the effects paints also have some nice colours to them. And that's what we shall be using first, wet mud. We are going to create a slight texture on the body of the horse with little effort using a makeup brush. Only a small amount of paint is needed on the bristles, and the technique here is to basically dab the brush many times onto the higher parts of the muscles, leaving the darker base coat in the shaded areas. This colour will build up gradually, and the aim here is to pick out the muscles and the flatter areas of the horse. My suggestion would be to take your time at first and get a feel for the paint and the brush in order for this to work. For me, I used a broken horse from a mixed lot that I purchased and practiced on that one. It's always good to have a test miniature before you start a project. That way you can write down your colours and get a feel for what the overall army would look like. Let me know in the comments below if you do this too, or if you just like to get stuck in. Next up, we shall add a lighter colour to pronounce the muscles even more. To do this, we shall add a small amount of skeleton bone to our wet mud paint. I would say this is about a 3/4 to 1/4 mix, but you can always experiment to achieve a colour that you would like as well. And we shall do the same technique as before, but this time focus your efforts to the upper sections of the muscles. You should find that you won't need to take as long on this stage as the colour builds up quickly. Just bear in mind that you don't want to do too much here, as it will make the overall horse much lighter than our original dark brown colour. You can also smooth out some of the upper areas by brushing in a circular motion like so. This will blend the colour in for us, leaving a nice transition from dark to light. Using the makeup brush for the majority of the horse, you can easily paint and finish quite a few horses in one session. And if you are playing Rohan, you may be needing a lot of horses. The muscles on the horse are looking pretty good, but we shall make a few of these even more pronounced so it will look even better on the battlefield. Skeleton bone was applied with our makeup brush, but this time only a very small amount is needed, mainly because it is a bright colour. And in a soft motion, it was applied to the upper parts of the legs, as well as any bony areas like so. The nice thing about using this brush is that we can also paint and effectively dry brush the face to enhance the details. This will pick out the detailed areas such as the ears, nose, mouth and eye sockets. Finally, a shade of mid-brown was used and applied only into the recessed areas. This not only darkens these areas down a little bit, but also creates more of a transition from light to dark. And now for the details of the horse. For the hooves, matte black was used to base coat them. And with the paint still on the palette, water was added to dilute the paint and make it into a dark wash. This was then applied to the tail, the mane and the mouth. And again, whilst the paint is still on the palette, the eye and nostrils were painted also. To make the hooves stand out a bit, they were highlighted with uniform grey. It adds an extra bit of detail for seconds worth of effort. For the horsehair on its mane and tail, hardened carapace was used. With a slightly larger miniature brush, it was painted on. I elected not to use a dry brush technique as the sculpt for the hair is quite pronounced, and instead opted to just glide the brush over and the bristles will pick up the upper levels of the hair, leaving the darker areas underneath. The same method was used for the final highlight of Monster Brown. The last few details for our horse were on the head. And these little details can add a lot to a miniature. So do give them a go, even if you're not too comfortable painting small details. And if you go wrong, just add some black back in. A small dot of spaceship exterior was used with a fine tip brush and applied to the upper section of the eye. And afterwards, some red was added for the horse tongue that's sticking out of his mouth. The teeth were next, and some Banshee brown was used for this. You can either paint dots for the individual teeth, or paint a line going across for all of them at once. And finally, to darken them down a touch, some strong tone was added to the mouth. And our first horse is done. For the straps and saddle, we will come back to this in a future Rohan painting video, as we will decide our colours then. But for now, we have our first horse for our Rohirrim stable. The second horse of the day, which has been inspired by a Pinto horse breed, is probably the most striking to look at when it's on the tabletop. This two-coloured patterned horse is my personal favourite, so let's begin by using our second brown base-coated horse and painting random patches of stone golem to the body. This was patted on with our brush at first to make the shape pattern, but also to create a jagged finish to the edges of this off-white colour. At the same time, we can paint the mane with this colour also. And once dry, we can go over the pattern again with a second layer of our stone golem. And this will fill in the pattern with a complete block colour. The lovely thing about these type of horses is that you could use a number of colours instead of this dark brown base coat. A quick image search online and you'll find a number of variations that you could use. Now to create some subtle shade on these areas, and for this we used a light tone shade paint. This was slightly diluted with water here, as we don't need it to be too strong. As each shape was shaded, I used a finger to pat off any excess from the flatter areas. And whilst this was drying, we can go in and paint our soft tone shade paint onto the mane, and let everything dry. Now we are going to tidy up our pattern. Some stone golem was thinned down with water and applied to the top areas of the muscles for our horse. This just takes away any of that unwanted shade paint on these areas. Lastly, some spaceship exterior was applied as a highlight to some of the defined areas, such as the knees and the muscles. This step is quite subtle and not much time was taken on this stage, especially as the main focus is the pattern itself. And now for the brown areas. We need to create some shaded areas to define those muscles a bit more. For this, we used some dark tone and applied this into the recesses rather than all over like we did for our white pattern. It doesn't matter too much if you get any of this shade paint onto the upper sections, as we will paint over this in a moment. Whilst this was drying, I made a cup of tea. But if you have a hairdryer at hand, then you can speed up the drying time and get this to the next stage. To give the muscles more shape on these darker areas, some dirt splatter was thinned down slightly with some water. I would say that the consistency we want here is similar to a shade paint, and I would recommend using a test model if you want to trial this to see how it goes. This was applied to the upper areas such as the muscles, and leaving the shaded areas that we painted with our dark tone from our previous step. Now, this diluted paint will dry darker than when it is initially painted on, so I would suggest to go over the model at least once, and if you want it slightly brighter in some areas, you can go over them again to your desired effect. Here I went over some of the areas a second time to build up the colours. The nice thing is this mix dries fairly quickly, so it didn't take long to do this stage at all. And with the body now finished, we can work on the details. The mane was highlighted with stone golem at first. This was mainly to tidy up the shade paint on the upper sections of the hair. Then this was followed by a highlight of brain matter beige, probably one of my favourite paint names of all time. That being said, let me know in the comments section what paint name is your favourite and from what brand they're from. It would be awesome to see some unusual answers. For the tail, we've gone for black. and this will add some visual interest to the horse, and also to show you a variety of options in this video. See, I'm always thinking of you. Dungeon Grey was used for the highlights of the hair. An Army Painter Monster Brush was used for this, as it's a little bit wider and thicker and perfect for this task. And it's good to have a variety of brushes at your disposal. With the paint still out, the hooves were done at this point too. Grey was chosen here for this detail, as it'll stand out a little bit more than if we were to paint it, say, black or brown. Afterwards, they were given a quick wash of dark tone shade paint, which was then followed up by a highlight of uniform grey. This grey was also used for the horsetail as a final highlight as well, but it was only applied to the upper areas of the hair, leaving the darker dungeon grey highlight to be seen from the bottom section of the tail. As for the mouth and eyes, I won't cover the same process again, as this was done for our first horse. But the exciting thing I get to tell you is that we are now ready for horse number 3. As mentioned at the start of the video, this horse was sprayed leather brown. This is a good neutral colour, and grey could also be used. We start by painting fur brown onto the body. If we used a black spray beforehand, then this colour would look darker, unless you were to paint multiple layers to match the paint pot. Likewise, if we sprayed it white, it would look lighter. So sometimes planning ahead and selecting an appropriate colour for your spray can be very beneficial. To darken the shaded areas of the body, mid-brown was applied into all of the recesses. Again, you can use your finger to take off any excess from the upper sections. For this horse, we will do the hair and create some markings first before finishing off the rest of the body, and you will see why in a moment. And for my second crisp tip of the day, you can use your shade paints with your normal paints to mix and produce a new colour. We will do this here with some mid-brown and stone golem. This will be added towards the bottom of the legs and also on the tail. The nice thing about mixing with a shade paint is that it is already translucent and runny compared to a normal paint. So when we apply our new mix to the miniature, the paint will keep these attributes and it will have a softer appearance once dry, which is good if you want to produce a quick gradient of colour. And that's what we're going to create here. Stone Golem by itself was painted towards the bottom half of the previous stage, so it looks thicker towards the feet. Now, as we mentioned earlier, if you were to get any paint onto the body at this point, we can easily cover it up with fur brown like so. This was 100% intentional on my part. I promise! For the horse mane, we shall use a different colour. Again, this is purely to add some more interest to the model. Be careful not to get this paint on the body. Some soft tone was applied afterwards to create some nice shade to the hair. But for the tail, it was diluted down with water to make it extra thin. And this was applied halfway down the tail. Cobalt skin, followed up by Banshee Brown, was used for the highlights on the mane. And for the tail, Stone Golem was applied with our monster brush for our prime highlight, before the second highlight of Spaceship Exterior was used. With the miniatures we have painted today, you could certainly mix and match the hair colours on the different horses, which will give a bit of variety for your collection. And now onto the body of the horse. Firstly, we will use fur brown and mix in a small amount of Banshee Brown to lighten up the paint. Once we have our colour ready, then this was diluted with some water to thin it down, much like the dirt splatter layer from our previous horse. This was then applied to all the upper areas, leaving the shaded parts to create that contrast. Out of all 3 horses today, this one will probably take the longest, but it also has some nice details to it too. Once this stage is complete, then the same paint was used, and a series of lines were painted onto the muscles. This does 2 things. Firstly, it acts as a highlight, which makes the muscle detail stand out more. But secondly, it also creates a shaggy hair texture to the body of the horse. Note, the way that we have painted the lines here goes against where the muscles lay. For example, as you can see, the muscles head down the legs, so the lines we painted go across the muscle in order to build up this texture. We also use the same paint and apply our final highlights to the horse's head. The final detail are on the hooves. For more interest, they were painted black first. But this time, instead of highlighting these, some horseshoes were painted using some gunmetal. With that, we have our 3 variations of brown Rohirrim horses from the Pelennor box set. These colours could be used on any horse in the game, and even some Hobbit ponies. The colours and techniques could also be swapped around, and you could create a lot of variety for your own collection. So catch up with me on Facebook or my website, and I would absolutely love to see what you create. And if you want to see even more content from the Pelennor box set, then check out this playlist right here. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.